Welcome to Bible at the Bay. Here we are in Honesdale, Pennsylvania with our special guest, Rabbi Dr. Jeffrey Coburn, head of school at North Shore Hebrew Academy in Great Neck, New York.
Very glad to be here.
Great to have you.
Thank you.
Chapter 21 in the book of Kings contains a really interesting narrative of the king, Ahab, wanting the fields of Nevot. And he asks him and he says, "Can I purchase your fields?" And he says no. And Ahab is very upset. And his wife, Izebel, in her core as a Phoenician princess, comes to him and says, "Okay, you're the king. You don't have to get his permission, even though he says it's his inheritance, it's his nachala, right? You can just take it. You have that capacity, you have that power. Why are you so upset?" So they orchestrate and they hire false witnesses to say that Nevot actually cursed the king and God, and so the punishment is death, and then his property goes to the monarchy. And then Eliyahu comes and criticizes, right, harshly. He criticizes both Ahab and Izebel, politically and personally, for this instance, for this case. And I think it raises a lot of interesting questions, because what we see here is, I guess as compared to other ancient civilizations, we have a limitation on the power of the monarchy here, right? It seems from the assumption of Izebel that, a king, you want property, just take property. What are you doing and going and asking for property here? But in this conception, at least, the Israelite kingdom doesn't seem to have that same capacity. They're not the omnipotent, sort of like all-powerful beings. And we have a limitation on that in the hierarchy and the structure of their abilities. Why?
There's a certain earthiness, I think, to kings, whether they were when the kingdom was still unified, and you had Solomon, who was the wisest and the greatest, and two prostitutes come to him to have their baby case judged. And he's available. It's not like they had to work their way up to the Supreme Court. They just walked in the door, it seems. So there's just a certain accessibility of the king, which carries over when the kingdoms split, it seems, and which I find very, very interesting, but it also limits the king. So he doesn't have this eminent domain, right? Like, I want that vineyard, get out. Which Izebel, who's not the nicest, greatest person in the world, just does not understand, because that's not the way the Israelite kings work. I think it's definitely a different, much more in touch with the people model than when we think of a king, and it's hard to think of kings today because they're really only figureheads, but the classical medieval, historical sense of a king, the king is way up there, and whatever he says, or the queen says, whatever she says, that's it, off with their head. But that's not what we see here. It's just a very interesting contrast.
And we also see the foreign entanglements playing out, right? Like she's a foreigner, she's Phoenician, she has a different conception of what it means to be the king, and that's when you see it kind of playing its way into what we would like to think is a more democratic, equitable, moral, political system. But because of those foreign influences, like we saw with Solomon beforehand, they play out in ways that ultimately bring down, in this case, both their sort of personal family and the monarchy.
Right. It's interesting that this is what tips it. I mean, it's not like Ahab has been a model of virtue to this point, but this is what tips it. And Elijah says to him, "Haratzachta gam yarashta," you murdered and you're also trying to inherit. You're like, you just go too far. So when you're a down-to-earth king, and that's the model, you have limitations. And that's something that I guess Ahab has to learn the hard way.
Right. And it brings ultimately the downfall of everyone.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.